Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Absolutely fantastic episode today. Talked with Shelley Puhak, author of The Dark Queens, the bloody rivalry that forged the medieval world. So much fun with Shelley. She rolled with every dumb little thing I said. Didn't make me feel like an idiot, even though she absolutely could have. She just rolled with it. She even came up with a drinking game that I will warn listeners now, do not try and play her drinking game. You will die. You'll hear about it when we get into it. In fact, let's get into it. I'm going to shut up. Let's get to the episode. Shelley Puhak. Let's hear from her. Okay, here we are with author Shelley Puhak of The Dark Queens. Shelley, thank you so much for coming on.
Brendan, thank you for having me.
So before we jump into The Dark Queens, because I loved it, I really am excited to get into it. This isn't your first foray into writing, nor doing it really well. You kind of started out as an award-winning poet, right?
It sounds really nice. So let's say that. Yes. So I would say my first love is poetry. Those would be my first publications. Although I'm also an essayist and a nonfiction writer, but short form.
Now, you are award-winning. Trust me, it's on your website. I don't know who wrote it, but it's on there. So I was wondering, do you have any tips for me? Because every time I write poetry, I still sound like a teenage emo kid, like trying to work stuff out. Or is that how it's supposed to sound? I don't know.
Well, I guess that would depend on whether or not you think I sound like a teenage emo kid. So I won't want to presume one or the other. But the former teacher in me wants to give like a little lesson here. So I would say for history nerds, I think the form of the dramatic monologue is where you want to go. Are you familiar with the form?
No, and I'm sure even if I was there, a bunch of people are not, so keep going.
Okay, so it's writing in the voice of someone else, typically like a historical figure at a moment of high tension. So an example might be Juliana Baggett has this great poem called Mary Todd on Her Deathbed, which is exactly what you might think it is, right? Where she's kind of like ruminating through everything and the stolen spoons and how she really felt about Abe, et cetera, et cetera. Or sometimes people write in the voice of someone who absolutely like mystifies or terrifies them. Like two great examples of that would be Patricia Smith has a famous poem called Skinhead, and Robert Hayden has one called Night, Death, Mississippi. And those are obviously in the voice of someone who most of us would find absolutely repugnant. And they're not necessarily acts of justifying that person's behavior, but kind of acts of like radical empathy to try to figure out just what would make someone who believes things so repugnant, what makes them tick. So I think those forms, generally for people who love history, really interest them. And there are a lot from the perspective of historical figures that people might already be in love with, like Anne Boleyn, walking to the block, or trying to think of some others. There's even the famous Robert Browning's My Last Duchess might be one people are familiar with from like high school, about like a Renaissance Duke who's speaking of, I don't want to give it away, but he's speaking of something very terrible he's done. So I think that has a lot of possibilities. If you find that you're sounding like a teenage emo kid, then maybe just try to write in the voice of somebody completely different from yourself.
And I've read some of yours, and of course I don't remember their titles off the top of my head because I'm very unprofessional. But what I remember is every single word that I was reading was just kind of one of those powerful words that a lot of, I think, poetry teachers say is you don't waste any words when you're writing poetry, that they all have to have some kind of oomph behind them or be very descriptive of something. And don't try and write out a sentence or anything like that, but really just focus on feelings, emotions, and specific things along the way.
I think that's great advice.
All right, good. I'm going to try that next time.
Okay.
But let's get to The Dark Queens. As you said, so you're doing poetry. Is there a lot of transfer between you saying essayist, nonfiction writer? Is it completely different types of writing to you, or is it a lot of the same things and just a different kind of flavor?
See it all as kind of a lateral move. And I will say that before I wrote this book, I wrote an article about the Queens. So I thought it was going to stop there. And that's when I kind of realized, okay, wait, I can't stop. I have to keep going. Maybe I have a problem, but maybe this is a book. But I think it's essentially, in one, you're squeezing it in. It's like parking. If you have like a really small spot or you have a really big spot, you've got to like fit the car in. So it's just a matter of the form and how much room you have to maneuver.
And this particular time in history. I a lot of times have trouble reading books about this time in history because there usually isn't a ton of research that you can do because there's huge gaps and things like that. It seemed like you found a good amount of information, and you did have to kind of connect some dots here and there. But was there times where you started digging into this deeper and you're like, oh, I'm kind of worried I may not have enough for a full-length book. Maybe it is just a long essay.
Well, because I started with the essay, I thought that's all I had. And then as I was digging, I was, realizing there's so much here. And I was actually really astounded with how much was there. And so I think I went into it knowing, okay, I've got all of this stuff. I was pretty excited. I felt like I had hit pay dirt. So every once in a while, there was a certain time period or a certain chapter where I might have, been worried, but I was lucky that I knew going into it that I had all of this to work with. It kind of was mind-boggling for me that there would be dialogue, like somebody went home and recorded dialogue from an argument that people had 1400 years ago. And there might be some exaggeration involved with the person who wrote it down, but that you could kind of have a sense of like what had transpired. And, there are even some arguments where I remember discussing with my editor, we were like, this is a medieval, like, you are rubber, I am glue, or vice versa, medieval argument, and to have it recorded. So there were so many gems like that I didn't know if I would do the story justice, but I felt confident that there was enough material going into it.
Well, let's talk about the plot just a little bit. So as you said, it's about 1400 years ago, and I'm going to butcher every name I try.
Go for it.
Just forgive me now. So we got Brunhild.
Yep.
Fredegund.
I say Fredegund, but I want to tell you one thing just to make you feel better and like all listeners feel better, is even the top scholars I've talked to say that there is no standardized pronunciation. Like even in this time period, people are spelling it different and people are saying it differently. So you can just claim that you are doing it in a particular fashion and just go with it because you're guaranteed that somebody back then was saying it that way.
Cool. I'm going to say I'm saying it the fancy way. But those are our dark queens. And then there is, and I'm not even going to freaking try. And I believe you have a line in this book where you're like, yes, here is another guy from the same family that starts with a C, and there's just a couple of different letters off. But it seems like they weren't very imaginative naming boys back then. Did you start to feel that as you started writing it?
I have to tell you that was one thing that kept me up at night. And in fact, my father-in-law just finished reading it and he came to me and said, have you considered putting in a phonetic pronunciation guide for these names? Like, what are you going to do about these names? And he said, if you write another book, could you pick one that has easier names? Because that apparently, was almost the straw that broke the camel's back there. I have to say there were times I actually debated because there's like, for example, this one kid, who names all of his children. It starts with Thud. So there's Thuderick and Thudibert and Thudidelia. I was like, can I just call them like Rick and Bert and Delia? Because it seemed like that would be much easier.
I would have went for it. It definitely would have been.
Yeah. They thought that maybe the scholars might object. So the answer was no. But in my head, I had to sometimes be like, Rick is mad at Bert. And then Delia's going to come in and try to smooth things over.
Well, thank God for the hardcover version, which I have. You have in the very beginning just a nice little list of who everybody is. And it's like, here's this and here's this. And so this takes place basically on the European continent, 1400 years ago. We have the two Dark Queens who are part of a larger family of the ruling class. And even though I'm a history nerd, this was something I really didn't... You hear about Charlemagne and you hear about some of the other big names back in the day, but especially this time in history, I didn't know any of these names. Can you even summarize this book for somebody who hasn't heard it, just in a few sentences, just to kind of give us an idea?
Okay, I'll say The Dark Queens. It's the true story of two women who battle for control of most of Western Europe 1400 years ago. One is born a princess, the other is born a slave. One is famed as an assassin and a military leader. One is renowned for being a diplomat and an administrator. And they both end up leading armies into battle and conducting a 40-plus year civil war against one another.
And they both really come from completely opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, Brunhild, as you said, she's come from this, and Fredegund starts off as a slave, and then they both become queens. But even becoming queens in and of itself was not something that was done back then, right? Like, they both had to, even coming from completely different directions, do a lot of different things just to even get in that position, right?
They did. And particularly for Fredegund, I mean, I don't want to give it all away, but, you know, we have to say there's like some sister murder and, you know, pushing aside other queens. And then even once you are queen, in order to sort of solidify your position as not just the king's bedfellow, but like an actual political advisor, then you have to, you know, plan some assassinations or dodge some assassinations, really prove your worth.
And then you do talk about how there's a feminist bend to the book, right? Looking at them as two women who, in an age when they weren't allowed to be strong, they figured out a way to be strong. But at the same time, you have to use the words of men almost the entire time, right? Because everything that you were pulling from had to come from a man who, depending on where he was and who he was near, it's like, oh, she's the absolute worst. Oh, I've just been kidnapped. Now, I like her, but I don't like her as much. That's got to be a lot of whiplash for a writer to kind of balance that out, right?
Absolutely. And I think I had to spend a lot of time talking and thinking about these various men's agendas. Would they know this thing they talked about? Were they even there? Sort of sorting through everybody's prejudices. Luckily, a lot of them broadcasted them. So like things they would say about their own mothers or sisters or just women in general. There's some things that people might wear on a date that's flashing red flag. And so there were a few of those where you're like, okay, based on your comments about, you know, your mother, I'm gonna make some assumptions over here. But there were a few things that survived very piecemeal in like Brunhild's hand, like a few of her own letters. So what was kind of interesting is to be able to sort of match up the picture you had in your own mind with the voice that you heard, even though it was snippets in some of these letters. It was really interesting and reassuring. And I think also in hearing what men wrote back to them. So even if you don't have all of their words, you can often kind of guess just by somebody's reaction, the sort of personality that they were.
You also have to deal with somebody who is literally a Dark Ages hype man. Who is brought into scenarios just to, I mean, literally, he's a diplomat who's basically just a hype man. They call him in and say, write a really great poem or speech about this person, and maybe they won't kill us. I have to feel like at some point as you're writing this, you're thinking, this almost seems farcical in certain points between just people dying all over the place and hype men and all of these kings who, you know, oh, thank God I have a son. Oh, he's dead now. Maybe we got a nephew over here or something. It gets completely crazy how these things work.
Completely crazy. I would always say that this was stranger than fiction. You would have to edit most of this out if you were writing fiction, because sometimes it's just so ridiculous and almost implausible, you know, as you're saying. You're like, how many people can die in one scene? You know, there'd be a point where they'd say, look, you've reached your limit, no more. But yet there were more. So it was kind of one of the fun bits about researching and writing it was I was almost entertained. And I know my family is so sick of the story, but, you know, I could come down to dinner and say, okay, so you're not going to believe what happened today. And, you know, they really usually could not guess what had happened today. I mean, they had, you know, somebody died, somebody was assassinated, but it was always in such a way that no one expected.
And no one expected back then either, because they would make all of these grand plans. I think it's worth pointing out just how often people would run to a church because you couldn't kill me in a church. I think a lot of people don't even know that there was a long period of time where I'm going to kill you. All right, just head on over and start living in a church just to see how long you could hold out.
For months, like years. That's what I knew. People kind of did that. I had an idea going into it, you know, that it's kind of like home base, but I didn't realize that people just took up residence there sometimes for years. We're just like, all right, I'm not coming out. I live in this church now.
I had 13 years of Catholic school. I don't know any priests or nuns who'd let you live anywhere for an extended period of time. But maybe that was just the nuns and the priests that I dealt with. Brunhild, Fredegund, Who do you think threw the better parties back in the day? Which one would you rather attend?
So I think it depends on your age and what you're trying to get out of it. I think if you're going for like networking, Brunhild's definitely throwing the better party. I think if you're looking for like the rager that you're going to be talking about 20 years from now, Fredegon's throwing the better party. So if you're going to like maybe meet a romantic partner, I'd go Brunhild. If you want to be like chased by someone wielding an axe or risk there being poison in your drink and then have to run for your life, it'll make a really good story, but I would go to Fredegon's party.
I don't totally agree. I think Brunhild's, for me personally, I wouldn't go to Brunhild's. I'd feel like I'd have to get very dressed up. And whatever I get dressed up in would be super uncomfortable.
Okay.
So I'd have to choose Fredegon, knowing full well, though, that I'd have to check everything I ate or drank because it might very well be poisoned. And that it's just going to be absolute pandemonium. Probably somebody would die at each party. Whether or not it was intentional or not, I really think that would be kind of the coup de grace of the entire party.
So would you wear like really good running shoes or like describe your attire for a Fredegon party? Because I'm kind of curious.
I feel like something loose. You want to be able to kind of move around. I think there's going to be dancing, some sort of witchcraft. I'm thinking a fancy hat, something kind of more flowy, kind of those jester costumes where there was like the big pantaloons and something like that. You got to stand out. Where like in contrast that to Brunhild, it would be something with the tight collar, right? You'd have one of those heavy, ridiculous hats, probably have to shave that day. I think it would just be a lot of bother.
I could see that. Probably, yeah, like some embroidery and brocade you'd have to like tack on last minute. I could see where that could be difficult.
I think you would be in trouble either way because just everything you'd have to wear back in the day, it would be 18 different layers. Everything would kind of be crushed in. I mean, when you read about what women had to wear back in the day, it's amazing any of them even lived.
Ooh, but if I could interject here, something really fascinating for the archaeology nerds out there is that they have found the grave of Fredegon's mother-in-law. And the really cool thing about that was the textiles were intact, which is something they don't often have. So they have like the full outfit. And what really surprised me is it's actually kind of loose fitting. Like there's no bodice involved. It might have been, different occasions. So they're kind of wearing what we might say like a linen tunic or silk, depending on how fancy you were. And then like a kaftan sort of thing that's embroidered. It's really fancy. They have a lot of jewels. They're dripping with jewels, but the actual garb they're wearing, because I was wondering about this, particularly with people riding into battle. And I'm going, okay, you could ride a horse in that. You're wearing something that's a little more like long and shapeless, and they would sometimes have a belt or more than one belt to, kind of give it some shape or show off the waist, but they weren't tied in, corseted in. So that actually helped me envision how they were pulling off some of this, because I could imagine them doing so like with a ruffled collar, and a really tight bodice. So I feel better like picturing it as a really expensive, very fancy imported kind of bathrobe.
I am concerned. I don't want to burst your bubble. Would they take the time to dress a dead body in something very ornate? Is that just kind of the, because dead bodies do weird things, so maybe you can't put him into a bodice or something like that. What do you think?
I don't know. I think there's like a few other things that have survived that point to, you're right. Like there might have been some things they did for like an older woman that would be slightly different. But generally the style seems to have been more like the Romans than what we might be used to. Like they were drawing their inspiration from back then, looking more to the past than what we might consider more kind of high medieval, if that makes sense.
When does this miniseries come out? Come on, we got to have a miniseries for this, right? Game of Thrones, kind of ridiculous, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in that happened here. Many people don't realize that Game of Thrones does have some fantastical things, of course, but a lot of times it is based on portions of history. So I think this is better than Game of Thrones. Yes, I said it.
Thank you. I'll take it.
When are we getting on the miniseries? We need to do this.
So from your mouth to God's ear, keep all the fingers crossed. So people are talking. I'm keeping my hope alive. I really would love to see it, but I have nothing definitive yet.
Well, this is a question for you. If it did somehow happen, which it will, we know it will, do you think this is a miniseries, a 2-hour movie? Do you see multiple seasons? How would you want this to go out into the world if it was entirely up to you?
It would be a 1-season miniseries. I could see maybe 6 episodes, maybe 8.
I'm going to say 8. There's a lot of death, and just learning people's names to understand who they are, even when they die the next day, which is a literal thing, it would take a lot. There's so much exposition that you have to go through, unless you really, Mel Gibson the whole thing and just basically change everything, which we obviously don't want that to happen.
I think it would have to start at the very end and then flashback. I think that's the way that it's going to make sense. But I do think the names would be helped by people seeing the faces. So then you could just be like the guy with the beard or the tall guy.
Right. I think so. And then we've already talked about the costume. So I think we have that completely covered.
Sweatpants, the guy with the beard, some swords, and some poison.
Mm-hmm. And if you do have any say in casting, can I be in it? Why not?
I mean, who do you want to be?
I really don't care. I just, every time there's a chance I talk to an author and their book might become a movie, I just ask the question. I'm not thinking anything big. I can be like Clothar. I can be Clothar.
Okay.
I've got the beard.
You do have the beard. So I was wondering what you're willing to do as far as like you'll wear the outfit. We've established that you are comfortable in sweatpants.
Yes.
So if you had to grow your hair long, like, would you do it?
I could totally do it.
They all had the long hair. You have the beard. But I don't know what how committed you are.
I mean, I will do it. I will look ridiculous. I don't know how long my hair. I was in the army for too long, so all I know is really short hair. And what generally happens is it kind of puffs out like I'm a pumpkin or something. So I already have a gigantic Irish head. It doesn't help, but I mean, to get my SAG card, yeah, I can do it.
Could you be a monk? Like, would you be okay with the tonsure, like having the...
Oh, yeah, I could do that.
Is that feasible?
Yeah, we can totally do that.
Okay. Because I'm thinking like, there's definitely like some opportunities to be a monk in here.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Even kind of monks, but not real monks. I mean, it is amazing. You talk about this too. The church is a huge part of this, but it's not the Catholic Church that we know in later centuries, where they can do whatever they want. Pope's like, you're excommunicated. You're going to apologize to me. This is an early church where they have to mind their P's and Q's, but they still have some protections. Did you kind of know that going into it, or was there a lot of, like we talked about, hiding in the church, or was a lot of this and all of these rules kind of new to you as you were going through it?
There was a lot that I learned. Like, for example, I had no idea that women were still serving as deacons up until the middle of the century, and they were trying to forbid this, and that, that priests didn't have to be celibate. That I found just hysterical. I mean, there are so many documents that are devoted to trying to get priests to stop sleeping with their wives, and people to just basically stop sleeping with other people. Don't sleep with your aunt, don't sleep with your niece. I mean, there's just so much. And I mean, one thing to keep in mind is what we have is only a fraction of what exists. And I'm thinking we have less than like 1% is what people have estimated. So I'm thinking of the percent of the 1% that is devoted to telling people who they can't sleep with. It's staggering. I can't imagine if we had everything that existed, what that would look like. But what's really fascinating to me is that I thought that sense of women were still very active in the church, and that things that we take for granted. I was also, raised Catholic. So I was like, wait, they're not even celibate. They're still working this out. And I was particularly surprised by this deal they were trying to make with married priests to be like, you can stay married because we don't like divorce, but you just can't sleep with your wife. You have to live together as brother and sister. And then how they're constantly surprised when that's not going over really well. Like, oh, it's not working out. So those were things that I found surprising and also entertaining, but also really going into that, you didn't see how that might be problematic, huh?
I was going to, thank God you went into it a little bit deeper, because I was going to rewind and say, you know what, that isn't enough for the listeners. We need to go back and say, yes, so priests were married. Before they were priests, they were married. Then they become priests. And it's like, okay, that's fine, guys. No more sex with your wife. And as you said, it doesn't go great. And they do seem genuinely confused why that isn't the woman you've been having sex with for decades. Now pretend she's your sister. I can't imagine that goes over well.
Right. And you only have one bed, but just like sleep next to each other, but just don't have sex.
And they would have children and everything too, which means it's all over the place.
It's very strange. Another thing I wanted to add was when you start seeing too, and this is the time period where they're trying to outlaw same-sex relationships. But that I also, was really curious about, like, so were we okay with it until now, or you just didn't realize that was happening, or what was the situation?
When you go back to those times, it's easy to forget that unlike Brunhild and Fredegund, who were all over the place, all over Europe, because Europe was just, the wilderness, basically. But for a lot of people, they never left where they were born. They'd go within 3 or 5 miles. And that's where those things sneak in, where it's like, you guys didn't know about this? Oh, you're just figuring this out now. Well, maybe if you traveled more than 2 or 3 miles from where you were born and, don't die of plague and everything else that's going on, you would be more worldly. But that was really interesting portion about this too, is a lot of times I think people who are not into history think of Europe as always kind of had an idea of what its boundaries were. But basically your book is all about how those boundaries didn't exist and then they were constantly moving just within the lives of Brunhild and Fredegund, where on any given day, it's like, oh, we're going to go take this city, and now this city is part of our property. And that could change the very next day, which it does on multiple occasions.
Right. Imagine like you're a farmer, just an ordinary person trying to make a living. And, you could literally have 14 different rulers in your lifetime because, first it was this person and then it's been gifted to maybe someone as part of their dowry. And then your town has been taken over. I think that's in some ways how the church might have gained some of its power, because you always knew who your priest or your bishop were, but you didn't always know who was ruling you.
I do put myself into the body of a farmer, right? His name is Alan. He's on his farm. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of guys on horses ride up and say, your king is now Clothar. And you just say, all right, cool, bro. Like, this doesn't really affect me at all unless you're coming to actually light my house on fire, which a lot of times they did. But I do wonder what happened when Alan first heard, your queen is, right? Well, but is that a thing that they would have even said, right? Because very often Brunhild or Fredegund were regents, right? Somebody who was looking out for a younger male. But as you talk about, they usually started to press against that and start signing things like, I'm the queen, this is my thing. And that was a big deal, right?
It was. And one thing I found really funny was the fact that people who were prosecuted for counterfeiting or forgery, even when there was a king, had learned to forge the queen's signature. So it kind of speaks to the fact that the common people, at least, knew who was really in charge. And also when some of these men died, it really didn't change things because she was still running things and now she's still running things. So whether it was her son or her grandson, there is that sense that it was in name only and people were aware of who was really running the show.
And one of the challenges for you, which it's not giving away too much, we won't talk about what happens from the beginning and the end, but in the end, there is a really strong push to wipe them both from existence. They obviously weren't successful because you could write this book. Why do you think they weren't fully successful? Was it because some of these things somehow lived in other documents and other artifacts? Or do you think that their lives were too big to really completely erase in the first place?
Oh, I like that. I like what you just said. I think there is part of that too when you say these people were really awful, don't be like them. But then you have to dedicate a lot of time to talking about how awful they are, that other people are like, ooh, interesting, right? And if you say this is the absolute worst woman, you do not want to be like her. And she's really, there's adultery and there's poisoning and there's this, and people are going, really? Well, tell me that story again. I also think there's a sense where marginalized people, particularly women, had a role, it seems like, in preserving the story. So, for example, there are some accounts of Fredegund in battle, and that when we look at how was this account preserved, the one account we have, it seems like there's some debate over this, so I want to be fair, but it can be traced to a convent in a particular area, and they're dating it by various things. But I think of this nun, it seems like it was written by a nun who's in her little cloister, but she's, kind of delighting in these, wicked woman and her exploits. And she's the one that's writing it down. And that's how we have it, is because it's recorded in these documents. So there is somewhat of that, of people just kind of being titillated and delighted by how larger than life these women are.
So everyone has always loved trash novels from just day one. Just give me the dirt and let me read about it. And people are going to keep writing about it and talking about it.
If you say, it's kind of like that, if you say elephant, right? And then like try not to think about an elephant. And then all you can think about is an elephant. So I think there is that part of don't talk about Brunhild and Fredegonde. And then people are like, ooh, but somehow I just keep thinking about them and I don't know why.
I mean, especially Fredegonde. When I think about a lot of shows and stories that we see nowadays, she's an archetype before it was an archetype, right? She's kind of a femme fatale. She's a strong woman. She's also a little bit out there, right? So even if you say like she is driven by power and she's very smart, there's also times where she seemed to kind of lose it and she's just on the edge of sanity. It's got to be interesting reading about somebody like that and recognizing how many things have come out of that archetype since then without even necessarily realizing who you're pulling from.
Absolutely. And I was always surprised that there was so much in terms of the modern times like that. Let me rephrase that in terms of the modern times that
I knew what you meant. You're good.
All right. Well, I'm thinking, though, we have Wagner's operas. We have Shakespeare's Macbeth. We've got all these fairy tales about evil stepmothers. We've got Cersei and Game of Thrones. I mean, if you think of these various echoes of her that have lived on, and to think that that's 1,400 years ago. I mean, most of us, to think that somebody would know our name or know any little bit of our story 1,400 years from now, it's kind of crazy, right?
I'm just trying to be remembered in a week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, a couple years would be great. 1,400 years seems just astounding.
But you've got a book out. That's got to buy you at least 5 years, easily.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Now, one of the things, I think we really covered it, but I want you to be able to, say it in your own words pretty succinctly. One of the reasons for History Nerds United existing is to take people who wouldn't necessarily read history and say, I don't like history. I'm thinking about 8th grade history where it bores the heck out of me. And I would say a lot of history is freaking amazing and you need to try it. The Dark Queens, what would you say about the Dark Queens to that person to say, here is your portal into history and you're going to realize how much you like it?
Well, I would say that this tale has literally everything. We've got disguises and ambushes. We have poisoned daggers. We have assassinations. We have marriage plots. We have secret heirs and hidden babies and gruesome executions. There's got to be one of those things that you find at least a little bit interesting. I mean, this is such a juicy and dramatic story. And I also think that if you hate history books, but you like drinking games, I could see the Dark Queens working for you for like bingo. For example, if you do a shot every time there's an unpronounceable name, and then maybe like 2 shots every time there's an assassination, like you could be having a really fun time in a relatively short period of time,
You could die, Shelley.
Oh, that's true. We should put a disclaimer in.
Yeah, no.
Do not try this at home.
Like maybe every 10th unpronounceable name.
Okay, maybe we take the names out.
Okay.
I
mean, every time somebody dies, I think you would also die. I mean, we're answering the question still, right? It's sex and violence. If you like either one of those, and everybody does, it's all in here.
And I think that there's also that, if you like secrets, if you like stories that have been suppressed, as I do, if you're that sort of person that likes to uncover it. My agent liked to joke that this was Hidden Figures meets Game of Thrones. So I think there's both of that. There's that sense of uncovering a history that people tried really, really, really hard to squash. And then there's that sense of it just being ridiculous, over the top sex and violence.
That's really good. Hidden Figures meets Game of Thrones. That's perfect. You might have to put that on the front of the book.
Okay, I'll recommend that. I'll see how that goes over.
All right, last question. I ask this of every author that comes on. It's a very important question because we've just talked about how smart you are. You're an amazing author, whether it's poetry, whether it's nonfiction, but we have been locked down. People have had a lot of extra time in their hands. So will you admit to the trashy TV shows that you watched during COVID?
Oh, so many.
Give it to me.
I will admit to all of them, but you guys might be here for a while. Okay, right now, though, I don't know if does it still count?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I'm obsessed with Money Heist. Like, I have a problem. Have you heard of Money Heist?
I have heard of Money Heist, but I don't think that's trashy. Like, a lot of people like that in a non-trashy way.
Okay. Trashy pre-COVID, Rain. Have you heard of Reign?
No, what's that one?
Reign as in a ruler reigning.
Oh, wait, yes. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Like kind of bodice ripper, Mary Queen of Scots and Catherine de Medici, and not at all historically accurate, but a lot of fun.
I think that was on the CW, right? So it was very kind of teenager version of it?
Yes. Yes. I will admit to perhaps having watched a little bit of that.
Watched a little bit by that, you mean unhealthy obsession is what you mean, right?
There have been some really trashy documentaries. I know all about aliens and where they've landed and where they're likely to land, and also how all ancient civilizations have been inspired by them. So I'm also like really up on that.
Also highly recommend the Tinder Swindler if you didn't get around to that yet. That's just a special.
Oh, have you seen Inventing Anna?
No, not yet. That voice, I don't know if I can put up with her accent. I know she's acting.
I love that voice. Oh my God. I mean, I've started talking in it and it really drove my husband crazy, like to annoy him. You know, I would purposely, I don't want to do it now because it's a terrible rendition, but it's kind of like my favorite way to torment people now.
Well, Shelley, this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that's it for this episode. Shelley, thank you so much for coming on. It was a fantastic conversation. Go out and buy The Dark Queens. You're going to love it, nerds. Go out there on social media and find us. Like, comment, follow, do everything you can. We really appreciate your support. Can't wait to talk to you next time, nerds. Bye-bye.